Story 1. The Christmas Visitors. When I was 10 years old, my family decided to spend Christmas at my grandmother's house in the countryside. It was a charming old place with creaky floorboards, a fireplace that crackled all night, and an attic that had always given me the creeps. My grandmother insisted it was just the house settling, but I never believed her. On Christmas Eve after dinner and carols, we all went to bed early. I shared a room with my younger brother Jake, and we stayed up talking about what Santa might bring. Eventually we drifted off, lulled by the howling wind outside. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was my parents or grandmother checking on us, but the footsteps were heavier, deliberate, and they didn't stop. Instead, they circled the house, moving from room to room. I could hear them above us in the attic, below us in the living room, and finally right outside our bedroom door. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the door creaked open. But no one was there, just the dark hallway beyond. Then we heard it, a faint jingling sound like the bells on Santa's sleigh. But this wasn't a cheerful sound. It was slow, deliberate, and oddly menacing. Jake and I hid under the covers, too scared to move. The jingling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. Then a shadow fell across the room, long and thin, stretching across the wall. We both froze as the shadow moved closer to the bed. Suddenly the sound stopped and the shadow disappeared. The next morning we found muddy footprints leading from the fireplace to every room in the house. My grandmother paled when she saw them, muttering something about the visitors. She never explained who or what they were. To this day, I can't hear sleigh bells without feeling a chill run down my spine. Story 2. The Christmas Lights. It was the week before Christmas when I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The building was old but charming, with a cozy feel that I thought would be perfect for the holiday season. My neighbors had already decorated their balconies with twinkling lights and festive wreaths. One night, as I was hanging up my own lights, I noticed something strange. Across the courtyard, a single apartment remained dark. No lights, no decorations, nothing. It stood out, especially since every other unit was brightly lit. Curious, I asked my neighbor about it. She looked uneasy and whispered, "No one lives there." The last tenant. Well, let's just say they didn't leave under normal circumstances. I laughed it off, assuming it was just a creepy story meant to spook the new tenant. But that night, as I sat on my couch watching TV, I noticed a faint glow coming from the dark apartment. It was subtle, barely visible, but enough to catch my attention. I stepped out onto my balcony to get a better look. The glow grew brighter, flickering like Christmas lights. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't coming from the window. It was inside the apartment, moving from room to room as if someone were carrying it. The next morning, I told my neighbor what I'd seen. Her face went pale. "That's how it starts," she whispered. "Don't look too long." I ignored her warning, determined to figure out what was going on. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the dark apartment. Sure enough, the glow returned, brighter this time. I grabbed a pair of binoculars and focused on the window. What I saw made my stomach turn. The glow wasn't from lights. It was a figure, pale and emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It carried a lantern that flickered like a dying flame. When it turned toward the window, I saw its hollow eyes staring directly at me. I dropped the binoculars and ran inside, locking the door behind me. But the glow followed. It appeared in my living room, flickering in the corner, growing brighter as the figure materialized. I don't remember much after that, just a cold, suffocating darkness. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. Sometimes, though, I still see the glow in my dreams and I wonder if it's still watching. Story 3. The Gift That Shouldn't Be. Last Christmas, I received a package in the mail with no return address. The box was small and wrapped in red paper with a gold ribbon. There was no card, just a tag that read, "Do not open before Christmas." I assumed it was from a friend or relative and set it under the tree. But as the days passed, I began to feel uneasy about it. Every time I walked past the tree, I felt like the box was watching me. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling. On Christmas Eve, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to open the box early. Inside was a small porcelain doll, beautifully crafted but oddly lifelike. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I turned it over in my hands. A note was tucked inside, "She's yours now." That night, I woke up to the sound of faint giggling. My heart raced as I turned on the light, but the room was empty. Then I noticed the doll. I had left it on the coffee table, but now it was sitting on my nightstand, its eyes staring directly at me. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Doors would open and close on their own. Lights flickered. And every time I looked at the doll, it seemed to have moved slightly. I tried to get rid of it, but no matter where I left it, it always reappeared in my apartment. Desperate, I took it to a nearby church and left it on the steps. That night, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, the doll was sitting on the doorstep, its head tilted and a new note in its lap. "You can't give her away." I moved out of that apartment shortly after, leaving the doll behind. But sometimes late at night, I hear faint giggling and I wonder if it ever really left. Story 4. The Shadow on the Roof. There's a story in my family about a shadow that visits rooftops on Christmas Eve. It's supposed to be an omen, a sign of something terrible to come. I never believed it until last year. We were celebrating Christmas at my parents' house, a cozy 2-story home covered in snow. The fireplace crackled, and the air smelled of pine and cinnamon. It was the perfect holiday setting. Around midnight, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. As I stood on the porch, I noticed a figure on the roof. At first, I thought it was just a decoration, a Santa or reindeer my dad had forgotten to take down. But then it moved. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It crouched near the chimney, watching me with glowing red eyes. I blinked and it was gone. When I told my family, my grandmother went pale. "It's the shadow," she said. "Something bad is coming." That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching on the roof. The next morning, we found claw marks in the snow and blackened footprints leading away from the house. 2 days later, my father fell ill with a mysterious sickness. He recovered, but the memory of that shadow still haunts me. Now, every Christmas Eve, I find myself staring at the roof, hoping I never see it again. Story 5. The Silent Carolers. In our neighborhood, carolers are a common sight during the holidays. They come in groups, dressed in festive clothing, singing joyfully from house to house. But last Christmas, something was different. It was late, around 11 p.m., when I heard singing outside. It was soft at first, almost a hum, but it grew louder, more haunting. Curious, I looked out the window and saw a group of carolers standing on the sidewalk. They weren't like any carolers I'd seen before. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 19th century, and their faces were pale and emotionless. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, singing in perfect harmony. I turned away for a moment to call my wife, but when I looked back, they were gone. The street was empty. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow outside the window. They led to the house, but not away from it. And on the windowsill was a single piece of sheet music, written in a language I didn't recognize. That night, I heard the singing again. This time it was coming from inside the house. Story 6, The Krampus Carol. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling softly outside, blanketing the town in silence. My family and I were gathered in the living room, drinking hot cocoa and admiring the glowing lights of our Christmas tree. Everything felt perfect, until the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fireplace. I assumed it was a neighbor dropping by to wish us a Merry Christmas, but when I opened the door, no one was there. Just the cold wind and an empty street. I shrugged it off and closed the door, but a few minutes later, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. My dad opened the door, but again there was no one there. "Must be the wind," he said, trying to laugh it off. Then we heard it, a deep, guttural voice humming a haunting melody. It came from somewhere outside, growing louder as if circling the house. We rushed to the windows, but the street was empty. The sound didn't stop, though. It was a twisted version of a Christmas carol, the kind that sent chills down your spine. Suddenly, there was a thud on the roof. My little brother's eyes lit up. "Santa!" he shouted, running to the window. But when we all looked, it wasn't Santa we saw. A massive, shadowy figure was perched on the roof. Its twisted horns curled against the moonlight, and its long, clawed hands dragged a sack that writhed as if something, or someone, was trapped inside. Its glowing red eyes stared down at us, unblinking, and its mouth twisted into a wicked grin. "Krampus," my grandmother whispered, clutching her rosary. She had grown up hearing tales of the Christmas demon who punished naughty children, but I had always thought it was just a myth. The creature leapt from the roof with terrifying speed, landing in the snow with a thunderous crunch. It began moving toward the house, dragging its sack behind it. My father bolted to lock the door, but the knocking started again, this time from every door and window at once. The lights flickered and the haunting carol grew louder. My grandmother began praying under her breath, but the rest of us were frozen in fear. Then the front door burst open and the wind howled through the house, carrying with it the smell of ash and decay. Krampus stepped inside, his massive frame filling the doorway. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to send us scrambling for cover. My brother screamed as the creature's claws reached out, wrapping around his arm. "No!" my mother shouted, grabbing a fire poker and swinging it at Krampus. The creature barely flinched, but it did stop, its head tilting as if amused. It dropped my brother and turned toward me instead. Before I could react, Krampus tossed his sack onto the floor. The knot at the top unraveled and out spilled toys. Broken, twisted toys, covered in soot and something that looked like blood. "This is your warning," the creature growled, its voice deep and resonant. "Be better or I'll return." With that, Krampus stepped back into the snow, his massive hooves crunching as he disappeared into the storm. The door slammed shut behind him, and the carol faded into silence. We didn't sleep that night, and Christmas morning felt more like a funeral than a celebration. My grandmother insisted we go to church, and my parents didn't argue. To this day, I can't look at Christmas decorations without remembering that night. And every Christmas Eve, when the wind howls outside, I wonder if Krampus is still out there, watching, waiting for someone to slip up.